for 368 days, we'd have this down pat. But I'm sorry, we're not going to be translating into French this morning. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kathy Bernard, founder of the Save Your Skin Foundation and Secretariat to CONECTed. CONECTed is a Canadian network of oncology patient organizations formed in 2015 to promote a greater understanding and the value of innovative medicines, companion diagnostics, and support care. Our goal is to develop evidence-based solutions that improve access to innovative oncology therapies and approaches that promote high-quality care and improve patient outcomes by focusing on an interdisciplinary approach to improving patient outcomes through policy shaping, solution building, education, and system change, so that all cancer patients can have access to cancer drugs, regardless of socioeconomic status, postal code, or other barriers. Next slide, please. Our steering committee consists of representation from Save Your Skin Foundation, Myeloma Canada, Colorectal Cancer Canada, CML Society of Canada, Lung Cancer Canada, Tim Finn Foundation, Lymphoma Canada, Quebec Cancer Coalition, and Quebec Breast Cancer Foundation. Next slide, please. The work we do at CONECTed would not be possible if it weren't for our generous sponsors: AstraZeneca, AbbVie, Bristol Myers Squibb, EMD Serono, GSK, Janssen, Merck, Novartis, Pfizer, and Roche. Next slide, please. We'll get started on the presentation in a moment, but first, just a few logistics. All participants in the audience for today's webinar will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the session. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of the presentation. You will see at the right-hand side of your screen an option to type in a question under the word question. Please feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to answer them in the last segment. If there are any questions that do not get immediate answers, we will contact you with a reply and any discussion you wish to have after the webinar. This session will be recorded and will be available in viewing in English on the CONECTed website. Again, thank you for joining us. Sorry for the late start. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenters for today's webinar, Getting Better Faster. Martine Elias, Executive Director, Myeloma Canada. Louise Binder, Health Policy Consultant, Save Your Skin Foundation. And Majd Ghadban has been supporting Save Your Skin and CONECTed's work in the areas of health policy, including work on this business case. He has a master's in translational research and is attending University of Toronto Medical School this fall. So without further ado, over to you, Martine.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and great to be with you, Louise and Majd. And congratulations, Majd, for your acceptance in medical school in September. That's quite the feat. So congratulations for that. We're here today to talk about the business case on optimizing access to precision medication. We have seen in the last few years a revolution when it comes to cancer treatment. And when Kath explained a little bit what CONECTed is all about, innovation, that's certainly what we've seen in the cancer world, policy shaping, solutions driven, and education are extremely important if we want to move ahead with a sound and good system for cancer patient. We've gone through a number of changes in the last few years, and as patients organization, we felt it was really important that we actually set the table when it comes to discussions around some of the innovations that have occurred in the cancer world. And to be able to do that, Louise had the brainchild of developing a business case. And the idea is to speak about what the healthcare environment is for cancer at the moment. What are the innovations and how do they make the changes that they do to improve the lives and the quality of lives of patients? Because that's really what patients or cancer, people living with cancer are looking for, and what kind of policies and recommendation we should put on the table. So for politicians and decision makers to look at, because we don't have time. Like, this is not a, let's go back to the drawing board and figure out what we want to do. We want to be prepared. We want to make sure that, they know that the revolution is here, and they need to know that they must act now. So with this business case, we really put on the table what are the key important issues, recommendations, and moving forward in the cancer world. So that's why we developed this business case. Next slide, please, Matt. So we started, I think it was back in end of 2019, in putting our thoughts together. So we really looked at it from a very sort of hierarchical and very sort of process oriented. So we thought it would be a really good idea to look at the current environment when it comes to precision oncology and new different therapeutics that are emerging. And I know that's exciting. I was talking to an oncologist just last night about what's coming down the pipe in myeloma, and it's mind-blowing. So how do we, sort of take all of this and, as I said, make sure that we're prepared? Then we looked at, what Canada has done with specific cancers. So we're looking at examples, and Majd will share that with us. Then we looked at the future potential for the applications of precision medicines and fight against cancer, and what would be some examples that where we saw some really good positive advancement, and how could we replicate this? So what are kind of the business case to moving forward? Then obviously there are barriers. So what are the barriers in the current healthcare system, the silos? We know there's so many silos when it comes to public, federal, provincial, and the territories, and also private payers. So how can they all work together, and how can we shape the policies that are going to be important for them to look at, and that we hold our feet to the fire to get together and actually make those changes? Then I guess the fifth element of our business case, which probably took us the longest, is that was really looking at the economic incentives of the new advancement in cancer. Think about it as doing a pharmacoeconomic analysis, taking all the drugs that exist today that have shown really good potential, and taking the pharmacoeconomic data from all the drugs that are going to be coming to the market. And how do you determine what is going to be the economic impact of these new medications? Because you're talking about basically curing some cancer, extending the lives of cancer. So what does that mean from an economic perspective? And that was actually very, very, very hard to do, and actually find the people who had the knowledge to be able to put some thoughts. And so we did what we, what we could, the best that we could. And I think we really have a good, solid position. So finally, the business case closes with some recommendations. Obviously, when we want to shape what's going to happen in the healthcare system, you've got to come up with some good ideas, because just to be sort of setting the stage but not saying what needs to be done would not make sense. Now, there's many, new elements that have come into play because of the pandemic. So where we've had the opportunity to make those changes, we have, or adapted the data and the information. So you'll see that. So that's kind of the approach we've taken. It's very systematic, very sort of peer reviewed, sort of worthy. And I'm sure that if we published or presented the work that we've done, it would get accepted in a fairly prestigious journal. Over to the next slide, please. So if there's anything that you remember from today's presentation, it's really up in the executive summary. So cancer is the leading cause of death in Canada. We know this, and it's not going to change. And we could argue that today the diagnosis has certainly been affected by the pandemic, and we're going to see delays in diagnosis and probably having an impact on the treatments, prognosis, and death in the long term, or the short or to medium term, I would say. I mean, some of the new treatments you know have been revolutionary. Think about what's happened in the skin cancer area, breast cancer, lung cancer. I mean, we're seeing survival rates that we've never seen in the past, even, you know, cure rate in some cases. Obviously, the precision oncology drugs and the companion diagnosis to, you know, sort of profile what the tumor looks like for an individual patient, and is really helping us to identify targeted therapies, and that we can direct the treatment directly at the tumor and on the genotype of the cancer itself. Precision oncology markers are, you know, way more advanced and much more cutting edge than, you know, what we call the burn in chemo. So, you know, no longer we have all these side effects that are caused by chemotherapies or radiation oncology. Now we really can, you know, look at eliminating cancers, and, you know, we're talking about minimal residual disease where you can't even measure cancer levels in the patient. You know, we know, and it's probably not getting any better, that some of the public policies around approval and funding of the cancer drugs are not keeping up with the pace of the new therapies that are coming to bear, which is, you know, something that is concerning. And if we don't make some changes and influence where this is going, you know, we're going to have some huge issues downstream. So I really believe that it's important that we work upstream. Time is of the essence with respect to diagnosis and treatment. That's, you know, to this audience is nothing new. And there's many, and we've, you know, since I've been working in the healthcare field, silos have always been, you know, a huge problem. And, you know, although we've seen some improvement in certain areas, we've seen the creation of other silos in other area. And that's going to be hugely important for you know, our cause here, because we're, you know, we're trying to break down the silos so we can see the benefits of these drugs, not just to the patient, but to the healthcare system as a whole. Next, please. So, you know, we talked about why we've developed this business case and creating the opportunity to have this dialogue, and taking the business case to, you know, to outline the cases where it makes sense to adopt different policies and, you know, break down the barriers and, you know, address the challenges that presents to our, you know, to our community. And obviously, some of the key recommendations, which you'll see later, really speaks about the timely access to life-changing therapies and maintaining our alignment with the 5 main principles in the Canada Health Act, which is public administration, comprehensiveness, universality, portability, and accessibility. So not reinventing the key fundamentals and philosophy of our healthcare system, but actually enhancing them in our recommendations. So I'm gonna, I guess, next over to you, Louise, I believe, right? Or is it Maj? I knew it, but I can't remember right now.
It's Majd.
It's
Maj,
me.
go for it, Maj.
Thank you, Martine, and hi and welcome everyone. I'm going to start with an overview of cancer in Canada, starting with the prevalence and incidence of cancer in Canada. So as we know, cancer is the leading cause of mortality in Canada, responsible for 30% of all deaths. And the number of people who have been diagnosed with cancer is increasing inexorably. In 2015, it was estimated that 45% of men and 43% of women would develop cancer in their lifetime. And about 26% of men and 23% of women are expected to die as a result. In terms of incidence, the age standardized incidence rate for cancer has been rather stable for a while, but this is not the case in First Nations. Although the incidence has been historically lower in Indigenous populations, lower than the general population, it is now increasing dramatically. In addition to differences between males and females, younger and older population, incidence in Canada differs widely and is evenly distributed across the provinces and territories. And in general, we see the highest incidence rates for cancer in the Atlantic provinces in Quebec, and then declining east to west. Now, since the business case was published, the COVID-19 pandemic had a dramatic impact on cancer care in Canada. Due to COVID-19, many cancer treatments, diagnostics, and surgeries were delayed, postponed indefinitely, or just canceled altogether. And we know that for every month that a person with cancer has treatment delayed, the risk of death increases by 6% to 13%. And since the pandemic started, over 83,000 people have died from cancer in Canada. The hardest hit by this pandemic were people with inadequate access to the social determinants of health. Now, as a pandemic response, the provinces and territories began rolling out virtual care. And at this point in time, the most recent data show that 40% of all patient-reported visits were virtual, with 54% of patients reporting it was the only option available to them. We also had vaccines being rolled out, which our current vaccine rollout includes 3 different COVID-19 vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. Some studies came out recently suggesting that COVID-19 vaccines may elicit a weaker or smaller immune response in cancer patients with solid and hematological malignancies. Following these data, as of March 26, 2021, the Ontario government has revisited its second vaccine dose timeline for specific cancer patients. And since then, Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have all followed suit and taken up steps to ensure cancer patients get their second dose of the vaccine within appropriate time intervals. Now, as of May 28, 2021, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, or NACI, made the following recommendations: that individuals who are immunosuppressed from disease or treatment be informed that they may have reduced immune response to any of the authorized COVID-19 vaccines. And with an increase of supply in Canada, the second dose should be offered as soon as possible, with priority given to those at highest risk of severe illness and death from COVID-19. Next, in the business case, we classified precision medicine approaches in the context of oncology. So precision oncology, precision oncology involves using information that are specific to a person's tumor in order to diagnose and plan treatment for the patient. From there, we have precision diagnostics and precision therapeutics. Precision therapeutics are the targeted treatments that are targeted towards specific signatures in the tumor. Now, in order to do that, we need precision diagnostics, which are also known as companion diagnostics. Now, these diagnostics enable us to detect these specific molecular signature in the tumors in order to make a treatment decision. And precision therapeutics, back to precision therapeutics, there are different kinds of precision therapeutics. They can come in the form of small molecule drugs, such as the kinase inhibitors. They can come in the form of biologics. They can come in the form of monoclonal antibodies. And we have immuno-oncology therapies. Now, to start off, I will start with small molecule drugs, which are generally well-defined small molecules that are manufactured through an easily reproducible chemical process. Next, we have the biologics, which are bigger molecules that are bigger and more complex, and due to that complexity, the manufacturing process is often more difficult. And then we have monoclonal antibodies, which are a form of biologic drugs, which are very specific to certain signatures, and they target the tumor and instruct the immune system to attack the cancer. And last, we have immuno-oncology approaches. Now, approaches to immuno-oncology include reprogramming the person's immune cells and instructing them to recognize and attack the tumor. Now, as a form of immuno-oncology, this includes adoptive cell transfer, which is also CAR T is a type of immuno-oncology. So I'm just having some technical glitches. So we wanted to highlight another aspect of immuno-oncology. Nowadays, the word vaccine is on everybody's lips, but as a form of immuno-oncology, there are therapeutic vaccines, which are vaccines intended to treat cancers. And there are promising results for therapeutic vaccines. The approach is that a sample of the tumor is taken during surgery, and then from that sample, a vaccine is designed that is then given to the patient that will instruct the immune system to recognize the cancer and attack it. And there's some promising phase 3 clinical trials for therapeutic vaccines in the treatment of prostate cancer, lung cancer, melanoma, colorectal cancer, pancreatic, and hematological malignancies. Now, where are we now and what is the future potential? So for some cancer, the benefits of precision oncology are already manifest. These examples include treatments for chronic myelogenous leukemia, lung cancer, malignant melanoma, and prostate cancer. And one example of a therapeutic vaccine is Sipuleucel T, which has shown improved survival in prostate cancer patients. Now, with better diagnostics and novel precision oncology treatments in the pipeline and innovative clinical trial design, there is a lot of potential for broader reach. And Canada is well positioned in the fight against cancer. Canada has some excellent cancer care programs that could be leveraged to make us a world leader in oncology. Examples include BioCanRx and the Canadian Partnership for Tomorrow project. And next, it's over to you, Louise.
Thank you. So I have the unenviable position of trying to explain our healthcare system to you and how decisions are made about the reimbursement of drugs, particularly through the public system. And it is really, the way we're constructed is probably one of the biggest barriers to access, and certainly it's a barrier to timely access at the very least. I think it's very important to remember always, and we mentioned it in our executive summary, Martine did, that the decisions about jurisdiction for health in Canada between our federal government and our provincial and territorial governments is really, the heart of that is the Canada Health Act. And there is still a common misconception that the Canada Health Act has made commitments to universal access to drugs. And that is in fact not the case. What the Canada Health Act has made a commitment to is, from the federal government, is a commitment to universal access to doctors and universal access to hospitals. And I think we could even argue about whether those commitments are being made, but certainly there was never any commitment that drug access would be universal or comprehensive or portable or any of those basic principles in the Canada Health Act. So what is the role then of the federal government in health, and particularly in access to treatments? Well, we do have Health Canada, certainly, and it's the federal body that reports in through the Minister of Health to Parliament. It approves clinical trials. It approves the sale of treatments based on safety and efficacy and good manufacturing practices. And it monitors the safety and quality of treatments after sale. So that's the role of Health Canada. In addition, at the federal level, the federal government makes a decision about whether to allow a drug in to Canada on the basis of price. And this is determined through the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, which is actually a creation of the Patent Act, but the sections relating to drug pricing also report through the Federal Minister of Health. So we have to ensure that drug prices, apparently, according to the federal government, are not, quote, excessive. And there is a definition in the Patented Medicine Prices Review regulations to the Patent Act and also in the guidelines about how to determine excessive pricing. The PMPRB also reports on pharmaceutical trends. And those of you who are engaged with this work on an ongoing basis, we'll know that over the last, I think it's 3 or 4 years now at least, there has been a lot of conversation about amendments to our patented medicine prices review regulations and guidelines. And they are apparently in the home stretch. We'll see. There are 2 changes that have been proposed primarily. One is to change the countries with which we compare ourselves in terms of determining whether the median price for the drug is excessive or not. So we used to look at a basket of 7 countries. Now we'll be looking at a basket of 11 countries. Some of them will be the same as before. A couple of countries have been taken out. I suppose the most profound change is with the US, which of course has very high drug prices, and they've been taken out of the basket. So that's going to purportedly reduce automatically, this new basket will automatically reduce the price of drugs coming into Canada. Now then, there is also a lot of conversation about adding a second analysis, which is basically a health technology assessment type analysis about the value of the drug to Canada in terms of price. That is something that is generally done through our health technology assessment organizations, and I'll talk about them in a minute. So this would be a new role for the PMPRB. And as many of you may know, there's a lot of question about whether, in fact, the PMPRB should be taking on this additional analysis, or whether they should leave it where it is with our HTA bodies. And in fact, there's litigation presently underway to answer the question about whether the PMPRB has this jurisdiction and the federal government actually has this jurisdiction. So this is still up in the air. In addition, at the federal level, the federal government has recognized that it has a role in the cancer control space as well. And so the federal government has set up the Canadian Strategy for Cancer Control, and they've created an independent federally funded organization that stewards this strategy, and it's CPAC, Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. And its goal, as described by the government, is to translate learning into pervasive and impactful frontline policy and practice across Canada for the benefit of all cancer patients or those at risk of cancer. So those are sort of the federal silos and the federal jurisdiction in health, drugs, and reimbursement. Everything else is left to the provinces. So basically then, the issue of reimbursement for drugs is left with the provinces. It is not under federal jurisdiction, other than the price coming into the country. That, of course, is a serious problem for the provinces because, as we know, all provinces are not economically equivalent. They are not population-wise equivalent, geographically equivalent. There's many, many differences one province to another, and indeed in the territories. And as a result of that, we see what has sometimes been described as a patchwork quilt of drug coverage across the country, because each province is making its own decisions about which drugs to publicly reimburse and which ones not to, and it isn't equal and consistent across the country. In addition to general drug coverage, there's also in almost all provinces a cancer agency which provides specific recommendations and advice to each provincial government about cancer control in that province. Now, to help the provinces and the territories make their decisions about value of drugs and which drugs to publicly reimburse, we have health technology assessment bodies. And they are recommendation bodies only. The provinces continue to make individual decisions about which drugs to reimburse or not. But what these health technology assessment bodies do, and we have two of them. One is CADA, which actually does health technology assessment analysis for all provinces but Quebec. And then we have INES, which does health technology assessment for Quebec. So they make recommendations based on a formula that they have constructed, depending on whether it's INES or CADA, to analyze the clinical data, the economic data, patient input, hopefully oncologists' input in some cases, where it's an oncology drug, and the feasibility of adopting these into our system. These are the deliberative framework issues that the oncology group under CADA looks at. The difficulty is, as I've said, that even after all of that, the provinces still make their own decisions. These are only recommendation bodies, so that creates inconsistencies for cancer patients across the country. And I think that's a serious problem. Now, we also, in order to pay for these drugs, the federal government does provide a Canada Health Transfer of tax dollars to the provinces. Unfortunately, over the last several years, that's been capped at 3% increase, which is far below really what the provinces need in order to actually meet the growing and changing demands of the health population. And in addition, of course, as Martine has mentioned, we have the problem of silo budgeting. For some reason, the provinces have set up their budgets based on the service that is doing the delivery rather than the outcome to the patient, by which I mean there's a certain amount of money that each province allocates for drug coverage. There's a certain amount for hospitals, a certain amount for administration, a certain amount for doctors, and basically those are not bundled together. They are separate silos in the budget. And once the amount of money that's been set aside, for instance, for drugs in a particular province is used up, that's it from that budget. So that really doesn't necessarily equate to the amount of these services that particular patients need at all. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but keep that in mind. Of course, we also in Canada permit private insurers to augment the public funding for drugs and other services as well, like sick leave and long-term disability and dental coverage and so on. But one of the trends that we've seen recently in private insurers is that they're very interested in hooking up with pricing and processes in the public sphere, which is certainly problematic because the concept of private insurance is that you can actually get something in addition to what's provided publicly if you, as an individual, or your employer or the union you work with or whoever buys the insurance for you is prepared to augment the cost that we pay for public reimbursement. So unfortunately, that's kind of going by the wayside. So I've tried to show this in a table as to how this works. So we start, of course, with developing a drug. And we do that through basic science in a test tube, and then through research and clinical trials first with with healthy adults in the first phase, and then with people with these diseases in the second and third phases. And once that clinical trial work is done and a researcher thinks that they have a treatment that ought to be for sale in Canada, they will make an application. Of course, they will also make an application for their clinical trial, as I mentioned earlier, through Health Canada. And then once the trial is over, they will ask Health Canada to approve the sale of that drug based on the efficacy and safety data and the good quality manufacturing practices proposed in the application to Health Canada. So I just wanted to I just wanted to point out that recently you may have seen that there was a decision to start a Canada Drug Agency also at the federal level. It's got a transition office under Health Canada, and it is, but it's very unclear yet what the terms of reference of that Canada Drug Agency will be. One of the first things that it may well have responsibility for is the implementation of a rare or orphan disease strategy and framework, which some of you may have been aware of, and you may all have been, some or all of you may have been engaged in the consultations that recently were have taken place about what a rare disease framework should look like. So other than that, we really don't know much about what this Canada Drug Agency's terms of reference will be yet, or what it will cover. We do know, of course, that for quite a while, the federal government has been making commitments to working with the provinces and territories on a national pharmacare program, and that indeed may be part of the work that this Canada Drug Agency takes on as well. But just to be very clear, no national pharmacare program can really go ahead without the agreement of the provinces. So while these are interesting commitments by the federal government, it's certainly going to take all of the jurisdictions to make this a fully functioning universal pharmacare program. In addition, as I've mentioned, PMPRB exists, and it is in the process of significant change as well. So I guess we'll have to wait and see how much of that change actually takes place. But the purpose, as I've mentioned, of PMPRB is to decide if a drug price proposed for Canada is excessive. So that's where the federal government ends and the provinces come in. And so that, as I've mentioned before, we have CADTH and INESS that provide recommendations to our provinces about what they should reimburse publicly and what they should not. And also, of course, they make recommendations about any conditions that they think the provinces ought to put on reimbursement. So, but ultimately, so that's done through CADTH. And then the provinces more recently have created through the first ministers, which are the premiers of the provinces, they've created a joint pricing negotiation program called the PanCanadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And basically what happens there is provinces that wish to join it, wish to join the negotiations, decide that they will join. Generally, most of them do. A province is chosen to lead the negotiations. Negotiations take place behind the scenes. They are not public. and if a letter of intent between the manufacturer or at least whoever's applying for the ability to distribute these drugs, once that negotiation is complete between them and the provinces, then again, it's still up to each individual province whether in fact to reimburse at the price that's been determined through PCPA, whether to do so immediately, whether to delay doing it, and in fact, whether to do it at all. So once you've gotten through all of that minefield as a patient, you may actually get access to treatments. And this can take literally years for this process to take place, depending on the drug. So it's very complex. It's more complex than almost any other country that I've become aware of. And the reason for that, of course, is this break in health in jurisdiction, or division of jurisdiction between the federal and the provincial governments. So if we move on to the next slide, Majd, will you switch that for me? Thank you. So as Martine mentioned early on in our, when she was describing the content of our business case, one of the biggest problems we had in completing this document, this case, was how to make the argument about the economic incentive for reimbursement of personalized medicine. And I recall speaking to a health economist very early on. I spoke to many, by the way, in order to try to find one to help us develop this part of the business case. And I remember the first one I spoke to said to me, well, you might as well just forget this section of your business case, because there's no way of actually making the argument that it's worth the value to reimburse for a particular expensive, innovative oncology drug. And actually, that's true in a sense. It's true if we're going to continue to live in this siloed world of budgets, because there's no doubt if you have a small population of people requiring a drug, and it's an innovative drug, and it takes some definitely some time and costs to research and develop it, for which one expects a return on investment, then sticking with the drug silo as the only way of reimbursing for that, or understanding reimbursement for that, there's no question we'll never be able to reimburse for all the exciting, innovative oncology treatments that are coming, which really leads to the reality that we cannot continue, if we're serious about getting people well, we cannot continue with the siloed budgeting systems that we have used in the provinces for our health budgets. And the other thing that I would say is that we can't continue to, and certainly I'm going to talk about the pandemic a bit in a minute, but we certainly cannot continue to extricate the health budget and the health needs from the budgets that impact health. So what are called sometimes social determinants of health, or determinants of health. So certainly we know that housing, employment, training and education, social networks, race, there are many, many determinants of health that are outside the health portfolio itself. And I would make the argument that what we really need is a big table where health and these social determinants are actually working together to determine where funding should go in order to ensure good health for people. But it certainly is not, it's not sustainable for us to think that we can continue with innovative drug development, reimbursement, reasonable reimbursement for innovative drug development, and silos. So, and there has been a real call for what is called value-based healthcare, which really basically looks at outcomes and where money needs to be shifted in order to get good health outcomes for patients based on patients' definition of those outcomes. What do I want as a patient? What do we as cancer patients want? What do we as specific types of cancer patients want? And then analyzing the services that will be required in order for us to get that kind of outcome. And it won't just be drugs, and it won't just be in the doctor's area, it won't just be in hospitals, it'll probably be a bundle of those services that need to be valued and funded. We know that there's an international group called the International Consortium of Outcomes Measures that has certainly been trying to make inroads into this approach. And in Canada, the Conference Board has also championed this approach, as have a number of the oncology and other patient groups through the Patients Redefining Healthcare Summit in Canada. And so we continue to work away at it. It's a very long-term change in the way we think about reimbursement in this country, but hopefully, if nothing else, perhaps this pandemic will be an opportunity for us to look at things in that way. So, and certainly a very recent paper by McKinsey in 2021 called Prioritizing Health, a Prescription for Prosperity, has determined that we could, if we would look at healthcare spending rather than as a cost, but as an investment with economic benefits, they have analyzed that we could expect to have health improvements by adding $12 trillion or 8% to our global GDP by 2040. So we need to, it's a real change in the way we think about health, and it's very important that we make that change. So next, I would, Majd, if you want to go to the next slide. I wanted to make just a comment on a few lessons learned from the pandemic. One of the interesting things is that we hear some nostalgia, you know, 15 or 16 months into this pandemic about, you know, the good old days. Well, there weren't any good old days for oncology patients. Before this pandemic, we were already really, I think, at the edge of a cliff in terms of our ability to manage oncology in Canada. And we were really running out of good ideas and good solutions to manage innovative medicines within the construct that we have now. So I don't want people to forget that we didn't start from where we want to end up. And I think that's really important, because we hear a lot about resilient healthcare, which resiliency means you can take a blow and you can return to where you were. But I think for oncology patients, we don't want to return to where we were. We really want to return to a place where the shocks that the system takes, not only can it bear them, but it can actually become stronger as a result of them. But there have been some interesting things that we've learned through this pandemic that I would like to see become standard of care, not just for vaccines for COVID-19, but in general within the health review system. So here are a few that I've gleaned. There's no question that clinical trials approval was vastly expedited for vaccines. So we know that these clinical trials were actually, the time for them was shrunk to, from what we've seen as really lengthy delays, to a point where the entire process took just over 6 months. And that there's, if they can do that for COVID-19 vaccines, I guess the question is, why can't they do that? Why can't they get rid of the unnecessary red tape and get these clinical trials approved more quickly for other life-threatening and quality of life debilitating diseases? One of the other things that came out of this is the concept of what are called rolling reviews by Health Canada. Believe it or not, I was talking about rolling reviews, and so were other members of the HIV community 25 years ago. And what a rolling review means is that as data from clinical trials become available, Health Canada will review them, and then when more data becomes available, they'll review them as an add-on, rather than what has been and continues to be practice now, which is Health Canada doesn't generally even open up a file for a drug to look at it until all the documents are made available to them from the applicant. And there's actually no reason for that that we've ever been able to understand. And so we know now that, in fact, rolling reviews could be the standard of care and should be for all drugs. It will definitely speed up the access to people. We also learned that you can, in fact, use phase 2 data to make drugs available through emergency use, which certainly seemed to be possible to do. And there is no reason why we can't use the same processes that we used for the COVID drugs to look at getting other drugs available to people earlier. There were no head-to-head trials or systematic or comparative real-world evidence collection analysis demanded of the vaccines, and yet so many conditions are put on the trials and the analysis of the trials for other drugs. Why is that? I think we need to understand that. There was no phase 4 trial mandate, which is usually with a drug that's very early approved. And we didn't see any systematic subpopulation analysis through the trials or real-world data from the outset. And so now we're starting to do an analysis of subgroups, including oncology patients, to see how well they were doing relative to people who are not immunocompromised. And I think one of the questions that it really begs is, have we been wrong all along, in a sense? Should we be doing subpopulation analysis of all vaccines that are being given to people? And in fact, maybe even other drugs as well that are given to people generally who are immunocompromised. And what does immunocompromised mean in terms of take up for some of these treatments? So these are all new things. They're not new things at all, actually, but they're things that have been a problem within our review system and our approval system. And yet we were able to overcome them for COVID-19, and I hope we don't forget those lessons, and I hope that we start to insist on these as being standards of care in the future. So if we move to the next slide, we start, as a result of all the analysis that you've heard so far, the analysis of what drugs are coming in oncology, where we are with innovative drugs in oncology, where we are with our review systems in this country, and also where we are, what we've learned is really possible through the pandemic and was probably also always really possible. We developed a set of recommendations. So starting with access to treatments, we certainly recommend a streamlining of the clinical trials approvals process, not just for COVID, but for all drugs. And particularly, we need to remove any unnecessary steps for those drugs that are for life-threatening and seriously quality of life debilitating diseases. We should be using notice of compliance for conditions as a standard for those type of treatments. That's what it came in for. It was brought in originally at the time of the HIV pandemic, but it's equally applicable to other life-threatening and seriously quality of life debilitating diseases, including oncology. There should be compassionate access through manufacturers. They need to work out some kind of process to ensure that people continue to have access to treatments while conditional approval has been given, once conditional approval has been given by CADA. Some new things that are going on that we're investigating. As I mentioned earlier, CADA has responsibility for the analysis of both oncology drugs and non-oncology drugs to provide recommendations to each of the provinces about the value of these as reimbursable under our present drug reimbursement systems. One thing that was very clear from early on is that we needed a separate process for oncology drugs versus non-oncology drugs. And there was even a standing committee on health that reviewed this and investigated this and said, absolutely, we need two systems, one that understands oncology and has oncology expertise to determine value, and one for other drugs. And that's what we did have until very recently. But it appears that in merging the administrative processes at CADA between the oncology and non-oncology drugs, it appears that we may have gone past just administrative processes to lose some of the other differences that are important in the analysis of value for oncology drugs. And we're certainly going to be having conversations with CADA to see if we can understand what's changed there that we really weren't aware was going to change. So stay tuned for that. And indeed, the other area, as I say, that's very much in flux is the issue of pricing at the federal level, with some regulations coming into effect in July, other regulations being put off until a later date, and court proceedings going on. So I guess we'll have to determine what we want to recommend in terms of any further changes to either CADA or PMPRB, depending on what's really going to take place as changes in those two organizations. In addition, Madge, if we go to the next slide, we also recommended under drug access. PCPA, we mentioned earlier, is the negotiating process for drugs. And one of the serious problems that we're aware of, even though we do not, as patient groups, sit into PCPA negotiations, nor frankly would I want to, we do care about the process itself. And one of the things that's become clear, two things have become clear. One, that we need more innovative contract negotiation processes. So it's a lot of talk about risk sharing between the manufacturer and the government, pay for performance systems where the governments pay up front and then they do an analysis afterwards to see if the drugs actually met the performance targets they promised they would, and if not, what are the implications. Germany certainly has a system where they put drugs on a formulary for a year and then they do an analysis, and they may very well take them off that formulary if the drug has not met its promised performance targets. So that, and the other thing, of course, is with the pandemic, the provinces have been so engaged with pandemic work that some of the negotiations have really fallen behind at PCPA, and we hope that that will get back on track and actually be improved post-pandemic. So other recommendations, any savings that are made in the drug budget, whether it's through the use of biosimilars, whether it's through generic drug reimbursements, whether it's through these pay for performance processes that we hope will be enhanced, should stay, in our view, in the drug budget. And in fact, if we switch our budgets to be more holistic, certainly stay in the health budget. We also recommend that private payers develop their own price negotiation strategies and methods based on their business model, rather than the present recommendations that the private industry has made, that they just join in with the public. And then on the national pharmacare scene, as I said, we're certainly in favor of a real national pharmacare program, for sure. But in order to make it that, we really need the federal government to work with patient representatives and other relevant stakeholders to ensure that the design of this new pharmacare program would, in fact, not result in anyone who is eligible for certain drugs now being eligible for less in the future. It cannot be that. It cannot be a step down for anyone. So on the next slide, we talked about evidence-based data. And as I've mentioned, we really believe that there's no reason why, with the right negotiation between the manufacturer and the governments, we should not see drugs that really have done extremely well after phase 2 trials from being made available to people. We also think that there should be more phase 4 trials. There's a lot of discussion about the importance of real world evidence. We certainly believe in real world evidence. And one of the ways to get that is through following people after phase 3 in trials. And at least it will let us know what happens in the long term to those trial participants. We definitely think, and Majd talked about this, the importance of companion diagnostics. And really, we cannot have these diagnostics continue to be analyzed, paid for separately from the treatment for which they are the diagnostic. They really need to bring those systems together. And real world evidence is profoundly important, but there's a big difference between real world evidence and real world data. Data is data. It is numbers, it is figures, it is information, but not every piece of data is evidence, relevant evidence. And so this, I think, has been a big problem for us, that people are collecting information, data, but there's no cohesiveness to a definition of what is really important real world evidence in terms of drug reimbursement and continued access to drugs, and what isn't. And we really need to grapple with that together. All the stakeholders are going to need to come to some resolution of this, taking into account, of course, protection of confidentiality of data, patient data. So those are our recommendations on evidence-based data. Now we're moving on to some of our recommendations in other areas, and it's over to Majd for these.
Yeah. So next in the business case, we have recommendations based on societal values and specific populations. The first of which is to include the social determinants of health. Federal and provincial governments, in partnership with patient groups, should convene a multi-stakeholder working group that develops a strategy to assess health systems across jurisdictions to ensure alignment and cooperation among the ministries responsible for the social determinants of health, such as the ministries of housing, responsible for housing, and the ministries of health. Next, the next recommendation is to do tribal and band consultations. So the division of jurisdiction over coverage of indigenous population, over health coverage, for indigenous populations between federal and provincial jurisdictions has created gaps in access to healthcare services, clinical trials, and precision oncology processes. And we must strive towards universal coverage and parity in process through government-to-government tribal consultations that have defined goals and accompanying deadlines. Next up, we have environmental and historical contexts. So new research must examine how precision oncology is affected by cancer risk factors, including exposures to carcinogens, behavioral factors, overall access to care, community infrastructure, environmental pollution, and the lasting effects of colonialism. Next, we must include gender programming. So we must account for gender in the next steps of precision oncology, clinical care, and research. Thus, our recommendation includes reviewing and considering precision oncology in the context of prevention to be inclusive to all genders, including Two-Spirit LGBT community members. Next, we have precision oncology research for indigenous populations. And indigenous nations need to exercise their sovereignty under treaty rights to create policies allowing them to gain access to health systems that provide precision oncology options, including emerging cancer therapeutics, covering care from prevention to survivorship or palliative care. Indigenous populations need to be at the forefront of cancer-related clinical research at cancer institutes and research centers. And by doing so, informed decisions can be made to be part of innovative clinical trials to determine if emerging therapeutics are effective for improvement in Indigenous patient population outcomes and community health outcomes. Recommendation 19 is international research, which is another option for doing research in partnership with sovereign Indigenous nations. And this can be done through international organizations such as the World Health Organization. These organizations could work independently with sovereign First Nations, Inuit, or Métis governments to build research infrastructure in medicine to guide tailored solutions led by Indigenous governments. And last recommendation on societal values in specific populations is to do precision oncology research that is specific for pediatric populations. So in most of the world, the mechanisms for payment, coverage, and support for pediatric care are different from those in adult populations. And this should be the case too in precision oncology. And a good first step for this is to examine the payment mechanisms for precision oncology treatment as well as research. Next, we have health systems, and it's over to you, Martine.
Okay, thank you very much, Majd and Louise, for an excellent overview of the business case so far. So I'm going to take you through the healthcare systems sort of recommendation. And Louise talked about the importance of looking at value-based healthcare. And, you know, this is really a paradigm shift for many of our jurisdiction in our different provinces, because they look at healthcare in a very different way. But it's becoming more and more evident that, you know, value-based is the way to go, because why do you want to pay for intervention if it's really not going to hit the mark on a holistic point of view from the patients and from the healthcare system? And, you know, the way to achieve this is to get everybody at the table. So the federal government, the patient organizations, and other stakeholders, being the provinces, industries as well, to determine what is the best approach to integrate a value-based healthcare system, and what are the tactics that we need to implement to get to the system transformation. It's great to be able to, or to talk about it, but we actually have to start doing it. And there's some very sort of promising discussions I know that I've been part on value-based agreements, where industry is looking at ways to partner with government, not just to look at financial sort of agreements or targets for agreements, but looking at value. So, you know, we're starting to scratch the surface, but there's a lot of work to be done This is a big change, and governments, especially health, they're big boats to turn around, and they've been sort of taxed with COVID-19, and we've seen that they're able to move, and so this is not impossible. There has to be a will, and that's what we need to work on and continue to push for. The other recommendation is the rare disease strategy, and I guess we had a crystal ball. We said that this is probably something that needed to happen, and we know that since the report was written, the federal government has convened a consultation on the development of a rare disease strategy, and invited stakeholders to provide their input through submission. And we, as oncology patient organizations, through CONECTed and some of our individual patient organizations, have put together some submissions, and we have, in fact, consulted so that, we can bring the voice of some of the smaller patient population to the table. And we'll see what happens, because we know rare disease is getting more and more difficult to get drugs approved and funded, especially in Canada. And talking about the PMPRB changes in national pharmacare, obviously rare disease strategy is going to be at the forefront of this. Then the alignment of the system. I talked about the silos, and really what Louise showed in how the system works was what I call the millefeuille approach. That's the pastry where you have all the different layers of the cream and the pastry itself. And really what we need here is a tiramisu where everything is mixed together. And there's really no kind of differentiation between, the start, the middle, and the end of the system. And everybody should be working together. And obviously that's going to take also a lot of work. We're seeing some changes or some sort of improvement when you look at Health Canada and CADIS in terms of the review alignments, but there needs to be a lot more, because we've seen that every time there's an alignment on, then there's an addition of a different kind of appendage that comes into place. So we've got to make sure that that doesn't happen. So obviously, how do you do this is, we again recommend a multi-stakeholder working group to develop a strategy so that we can assess the healthcare system jurisdiction across the board and make sure that they're all aligned, and that we get a good tiramisu out of this. Pathologists, that's something, you probably would not have thought that we would put in our recommendations, because that's kind of never been sort of on the radar screen. But with precision medicine and, the era of looking at the molecule to see how you treat the cancer, it's not necessarily based on, the type of cancer, but actually the what's happening in the molecule itself. We need to make sure that the people who are looking at the slides and the molecules have the right resources to be able to do their work, and that they have the proper diagnostic sort of guidelines and treatment sort of directions so to advance the science. So that's really important. Next slide. Obviously, as we mentioned all along, the pandemic kind of came towards the tail end of us finalizing the report. So, we've learned tons and tons through the pandemic. And so we have to make sure that we incorporate our lessons that we've learned through the pandemic. And think of only one virtual meetings with healthcare professionals. They seem very common sense, but they're not, the answer to everything. And we have to use them strategically, and we have to use them where it makes sense from the interaction between the patient and the clinician, but in where the patient is in their journey with their disease. And think about, some of the work that had been done in the past. You've got the recommendations from the SARS Commission. You've got the CREVER Commission, which, if you're born past that 1970 or 80, you probably would not have heard about it, but this is a huge body or research that was done on the inquiry of the blood systems in Canada, and they made some really strong recommendations. So there's ways to take what's happened during the COVID crisis and be able to analyze and make recommendations. And we've seen some of the recommendations from the blood system inquiry or the Creever Commission being implemented, and as well as from the SARS Commission. So we've got to make sure that that continues or that happens. And finally, we talked about the inclusion of the subpopulation in clinical trial. I mean, think about cancer in the immunocompromised population. When cancer trials are done, they're done in a fairly homogeneous population, but that's not really always the case. That when a drug is approved or used at a broader level,